First of all, we're going to wrap up our look at the major groups of dinosaurs. We had been looking at Avialian evolution, so Aviale, modern birds, and everything closer to modern birds than to Deinonychus. So now we marched our way up from the base of Aviale, so things like Anchiornis and Archaeopteryx, up to the Pygostylians, where the tail gets shortened up. So we had creatures like Confuciusornis in that part of the tree. Then this big radiation, the Ornithothoraceans, the ones with more fully equipped flight apparatus, including the Alula and so forth. And that included two major branches, the Enantiornithes, this big radiation of Cretaceous birds, and Euornithes. Within Euornithes, we saw some early branches, and then we saw specifically at Chironae, the evolution of the big deep keel, and even more sophistication of the wing morphology. We saw Ichthyornis as an early branch of that. So now we're at Ornithurae. The name means bird tail. It's a traditional name in paleoornithology. This is a group that's from the late part of the early Cretaceous onward. In this group, the premaxilla now makes up most of the beak, or the upper jaw. So we can see here in Hesperorniths, the maxilla down over here still has teeth in it. The premaxilla, which in this case happens to be toothless, now makes up the majority of the upper jaw. So this is Hesperorniths, the last major group of toothed birds, or part of the last major group of toothed birds, Hesperornithines. Oh, just to compare the Hesperorniths, here we see the step right below this. So the node right below this, the maxilla is still the majority of the upper jaw. So we switched to this. So I want to say a little bit about Hesperornithes. The name means western bird, referring to the American West. They're a Cretaceous group, so they don't survive the Great Cretaceous extinction. Early forms were still flyers. They still had wings. The advanced clade within this group, called Hesperornithidae, has wings that are extremely reduced. So let's take a look at this. Here's the scapula, the scapulocoracoid. There's the humerus. There's the forearm. There's the hand. So that's not a wing anymore. It's a stump. It's not a paddle either. These guys were not paddle swimmers like penguins. They were foot-propelled divers like grebes or loons. And they were indeed seagoers. We find them, there were some in freshwater as well. But many of them were seagoing animals. These are actually the only marine dinosaurs of the Cretaceous. So remember, the great marine reptiles of the Mesozoic, the ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs and mosasaurs, those aren't dinosaurs. This is the dinosaurs. This is the only seagoing dinosaur of the Mesozoic. And so, yeah, in some cases, it looks like the forearm and the manus itself are lost. They're just a humerus. So, a weird group. Also, a group of large-bodied birds. Take a look at these silhouettes. They're to scale with that human skeleton. So, Hesperornis itself and its close relatives are good-sized birds, bigger than most living, say, penguins or something. And again, early forms were probably good flying birds, but later forms most definitely were not. So these were part of the marine community. So here we see a flock of them in the surf with the pterosaurs, which remember are not dinosaurs, which are perfectly good flyers, and here a Tylosaurus, a mosasaur, about to munch down on one of them, a big seagoing lizard. Now, we have no evidence that they retained eggs inside their bodies. No evidence, in fact, of that anywhere in Dinosauria. And so they almost certainly could move around on land to some degree in order to nest. But given their anatomy, they weren't particularly good at moving around on land. And finally, Aves, the group of modern birds. The name just means birds, as I said before. It is the Latin word for bird, the Latin plural for bird. A group that first appears in the late Cretaceous, and of course we still have them today. The group is defined as the ancestor of all modern birds and all its descendants. The full definition includes a specific list of genera, but we don't need to know that for this class. there's over 10,000 living species of birds. In contrast, there's only about 6,000 species of living mammal. Less than 6,000. And just 2,000 years ago, there were over 12,000 species of birds. What happened in those last 2,000 years is the human colonization of the Pacific. As the Polynesians spread throughout the Pacific, might have been some great adventures and foundation of many interesting cultures, but devastated the local communities of animals and plants, and in particular, birds that lived, many of them lived singly on those particular islands, got wiped out. It's just one species limited to one island. So what makes a member of Aves Aves? How are they distinguished from all these earlier Mesozoic birds? Well, they have entirely toothless beaks. So at this point, toothless beaks evolved in the condition we see in modern birds. So all modern birds are toothless, and the ancestor of all modern birds were toothless. But the ancestor of modern birds and their closest extinct relatives, Hesperornithes, was toothed. The maxilla is even more reduced than we saw it in Hesperorniths. We'll see. I'll show these individually in a bit. The premaxillae are extensively fused to each other. They're essentially a single bone. The left and right are fused together. The dentaries are fused together. They're fused to the predentary bone, that weird little predentary bone that showed up in Ornithures, and the postdentary bones are fused into them. So in modern birds, there's just a single bone in the lower jaw. And just, there's the coracoids, the other part of the shoulder blade, it's pneumatic, so it's hollow, it's got an air sac chamber, and there's a huge number of other shared-derived characters, many of which we can recognize in soft tissue. This is not an ornithology class, we're not going to go into them. So I'm just showing ones that are sort of distinctive compared to the type of information we had for non-bird dinosaurs. So here's the fused premaxillae. You can see, up this trend here. You don't see the suture anymore between the left and the right. Oh, this is an ostrich, by the way. Here we look at the maxillae in green and the premaxilla in pink, at least for the lower diagram. I added the upper two based on newer information. And you can see the amount of green on the two living groups of modern birds represented, how tiny that maxilla is. So the upper jaw is almost all premaxilla. And this is the other jaw. This is the lower jaw. The dentaries fuse together. That thing that was a separate ossification, a predentary bone at the front end of the jaw, has fused to the two dentaries. And this is the entire mandible. So this includes the postdentary bones, which, remember, in other dinosaurs, including all these other avialians, are separate bones. They function as separate bones. So there's a lot of fusion in bird anatomy. But even with toothless beaks and fused lower jaws, birds do a huge amount of different types of things with their bills. And one of the attributes that allows them to do that, and we're not going to explore that in great detail because, again, this is not an ornithology class, is that the rearrangement and fusion of some of those jaw elements actually winds up producing new joints in the skull of birds, so that the beak, basically the premaxilla, can move up and down and sometimes forward and backwards relative to the rest of the skull. And that allows them to manipulate food in all sorts of different ways. Sort of the extreme example of that is a parrot. So next time you've seen a member of the parrot group, so a parrot or a parakeet or a lorikeet or whatever, if you've got one as a pet or a friend who has one as a pet or go to a pet store or a zoo, you can see them manipulating food by moving their beaks around. Now, Aves itself may be the group of modern birds, but they actually appear in the Cretaceous. And indeed, we have representatives, probably, of some of the modern groups of birds in the latest part of the Cretaceous, the last several million years. Now, some of these identifications remain a little uncertain, but it looks like relatives of the pheasants, relatives of the ducks, relatives of the loons, and then a bunch of different relatives of seabirds, relatives of petrels, of pelicans, of cormorants, and various other shore birds. And you'll notice that with the exception of of the pheasant relatives, most of those are shoreline or sea-dwelling birds. And that's going to be important when we talk about extinctions later on. So they gave this here, depending upon the phylogeny, often comes out as sort of a proto-duck, sort of a relative of the duck plus goose plus swan group. Now, in the last couple years, we've had an amazing new discovery of a member of Aves from the latest Cretaceous, from the rocks near the town of Maastricht in Holland. So these are the rocks after which the last stage of the Cretaceous, the Maastrichtian, is named, which is where Mosasaurus is from. The specimen was actually mostly in a chunk of chalk, and it was CT scanned. They saw this bone sticking out. They said, we're going to CT scan to see if there's other bones, and lo and behold, there was a skull in there. A mostly undeformed skull, which is rare for finding in Mesozoic birds. So they digitally prepared it out. It's called Hesperornithes. And it turns out, this is what the actual specimen looked like. They had no idea when they were going to CT scan it that there would be a skull inside of it, and then various other bits and pieces. So here's a restoration of it. And we can see a totally toothless premaxilla, which makes up the vast majority of the upper jaw. That is a 3D print, because they can't even excavate it out of that chalk. It would probably come apart. So they're able to CT scan it and then 3D print it so you can see its size. It's a tiny little animal. And it seems to be a close relative of the chickens and the ducks. Basically the fowl and the waterfowl, which are each other's closest relatives. So here's little Hesperornithes. The nickname for it was the wonder chicken, but it doesn't seem to be any more closely related to chickens than it is to ducks. And here they show one walking on the shoreline. In the background is a dead Mosasaurus, and feeding on it are some Ichthyornis relatives, so toothed flying birds. And it's a little guy. So the dashed line here is the size of Hesperornithes, and then the two close relatives of them, the Galliforms, those are the pheasant group, so pheasants, chickens, turkeys, etc. And the Anseriforms, those are ducks, swans, geese. And this is from the very smallest living form to the very largest living forms. And you can see it's in the small range for those groups. Now, modern birds, we're not going to talk with this in any great detail, but I should at least mention the basic phylogeny of modern birds. So Aves splits into two subdivisions, a group called the Paleonates, or ancient jaws. These include the flightless ratites. Ratites include things like ostriches, kiwis, emus, the extinct moa, rheas, etc. And the flying tinamous. And then a larger group called Paleognathae, the modern jaws. Within the Paleonates, there's this Gallo-Anserian group, which is, the name means chicken goose. So that's the fowl and the waterfowl, which include the majority of fish, the majority of birds that we eat on a regular basis, by the way. So the pheasant group, that includes chickens and turkeys, and the duck, swan, goose group. So Hesperornithes seems to be a Gallo-Anserian. And then everyone else. And this everyone else group, Neo-Aves, the modern birds, this is a hugely diverse group. The relationships within them are still being worked out by various both molecular DNA studies and fossil information. And I should point out here too, when we think about birds like having their songs in the spring and nesting up in trees, and we think about those as being a normal bird trait, it isn't. These guys don't do that. These guys don't do that, and the early branches of these guys don't do that. Nesting up in trees, where you actually build a nest and you put your eggs in them, and you have the dawn chorus and so forth, that is a highly derived set of traits way up in Neo-Aves. So don't think of that as a bird trait. Even within modern birds, it's a derived trait. And since I talked about forelimb reduction in various groups of theropods before, I should mention the ultimate in forelimb reduction in theropoda. These are the moa. The moa are an extinct group of giant birds from New Zealand, but only extinct by about 1,000 years. Oxford University, Cambridge University, the University of Paris were all teaching students, and there were moa still living in New Zealand. These guys don't even have a scapulocoracoid, much less a humerus, radius, ulna, or manus. So they lost the forelimb. And we have thousands of skeletons of these guys. If they had those bones, we would have found them. So this is the extreme in forelimb reduction within all of Dinosauria. Now, just to sort of wrap things up about birds in general, before we move on to the topic of flight. Modern birds are incredibly distinctive compared to their closest living relatives, crocodilians. And that's the reason in traditional systematics, we look at crocodilians and then we compare them to lizards or tuataras, and they don't look that much different and look really different than birds. And that's because we've lost all these branches in between that had some, but not all of those traits. So it's due to the extinction of the non-bird part of Dinosauria that makes living birds distinct. And if some of these other groups in here survived, it would have reduced the distinctiveness of living birds. And there it goes. It's always at some point. Let's see. And so let's just remember, Dinosauria is the concestor of Iguanodon, Megalosaurus, and Diplodocus, and all of its descendants. So that's a dinosaur, and 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 that's a dinosaur, as much as Triceratops is. And we know what dinosaurs taste like. They taste like chicken. But at least the ones that are chicken. The ones that are turkey taste like turkey. The ones that are ostrich taste like ostrich. So yes, walking with dinosaurs. So dinosaurs are still with us. They're still fairly common. And indeed, it's not like birds are some weird early branch of Dinosauria. They're deeply nested within the carnivorous dinosaurs. T-Rex is much more closely related to sparrows than it is to Triceratops or Stegosaurus. And ironically, birds are not bird-hipped dinosaurs. Although obviously they're dinosaurs. And obviously birds have bird hips by definition. So they're bird-hipped dinosaurs, but they're not ornithischians, the group whose name means bird-hipped dinosaurs. So they're saurischians, they're not bird-hipped dinosaurs, but they are, of course, bird-hipped dinosaurs. And don't get me started on Orthopoda either. They obviously have bird feet, too. So why are birds lizard-hipped beast feet and not bird-hipped bird feet? Well, that's just the history of taxonomy for you. And just remember, no matter how cool you are, your ancestors are not dinosaurs. And, this idea finally is getting out there sort of in meme space and so forth. So, oh my God, it's a living dinosaur. And those are what actually down here. These are what living dinosaurs look like. But I haven't really addressed the important thing about birds, or rather what most people would consider is the important thing about birds, the form of locomotion they have that's distinctive from all other organisms, and that's the new lecture that we switch over to now. Okay. So, dinosaurs take flight. So, flight is, of course, the main attribute most of us think about when we think about birds. It's something that makes them extremely distinctive. And they are one of very few groups of truly flying vertebrates. In the modern world, there's only one other group of powered flying vertebrates, and those are bats. Although, as we'll see in the extinct world, there were others. And then, of course, there are the insects, which are also flyers, but are really not that comparable. So, yes, they fly in a V formation because it stands for vengeance. Their ancestors once ruled the world. One day they'll come for us. Okay, so bird flight doesn't work without feathers. Just to show you what the internal structure of a feather looks like, or this pennaceous feather, we've got this internal shaft, a hollow shaft. Coming off of the shaft are branches, coming off the branches are sub-branches, coming off the sub-branches are sub-branches, coming off the sub-branches are sub-sub-sub-branches, and coming off those are little prongs. So it's very fractal. And those tiny little prongs, that's what allows these feathers to hold together, and yet, you strip along them, they'll come unzipped, and you put them back the other way, and they zip up again. they're made chemically of the same material, beta-keratin, as the scales of other sauropsids. And let's just remember that not all feathers in a modern bird are flight feathers. So tail feathers, and it says flight feathers, I would say wing feather is a better aspect because tail feathers are flight feathers too. But then there are the types of feathers that are contour body feathers, like the semi-plumes, and then various display feathers. And then before birds fly, so when they're little babies, and in some cases in adults that happen to live in very cold environments, they have sort of an undercoat of down. So it's feathers that aren't structurally particularly strong, but are really good at trapping in heat, which is the reason that humans use them to stuff pillows and mattresses. Feathers, of course, also do things like give the body profile of a bird. They give the contour of its body. They give coloration. Here's a woodpecker finch that I was lucky to see in the Galapagos once. Here is a male brown pelican. I can't remember if that's the same trip or not. You can see that wonderfully coppery brown neck there. In modern birds that lack flight, so here are a couple of rat types, a cassowary and an emu, the feathers often lose their pennaceous shape. But these guys didn't ancestrally have just these hair-like feathers. Ancestrally, modern rat types are the descendants of flyers, and they had good pennaceous feathers. But since for millions of years they've not been flyers, their feathers have not been under the constraint to build these complex structures, and they sort of reverted to a more simple form. Feathers are organized in all sorts of ways. To form the wing, you don't need to know the details here, just showing that the different feather shapes form different parts of the wing. And as I've talked about, as we've marched our way up Dinosauria, we've seen the changes that happen in feather phylogeny. So starting with probably hollow quills, and then a big expression of these plumulose, these down-like protofeathers among many forms. And then as we get up into Maniraptora, or maybe Maniraptora plus Ornithomimosaurs, we get various types of pennaceous feathers. And as I mentioned, an intriguing discovery that was made simultaneous to the paleontological discoveries was that the genes involved in the production of a feather activate in sequence to produce all these steps. So you get one set of genes that starts, and it starts making the central shaft, and then it kicks in and it starts subdividing that shaft into multiple branches, and then one of them, it gets activated to become the main shaft of it, the rachis, and then others produce the subdivisions of that, and the subdivisions of that, and so forth. So the sequence of activation of the products in the development of a living feather mirrors the paleontological transformations we saw in the history of feather evolution. So this is just a little animation of that same drawing from before. You see feather complexity increasing. All right. In terms of the distribution, plumulose or downy feathers seem to be, well, we have them in primitive theropods, including tyrannosaurs and Sauromimos and so forth, and perhaps homologously in ornithischians. Again, it's not certain that the fuzz of ornithischians is homologous to those in theropods. Pennaceous feathers on the arms, maybe the tail. At Ornithomimosaurs, as I said, the data for that is ambiguous, so not everyone agrees with that. Definitely, though, broad pennaceous feathers on the arms and tail in Maniraptora, and long pennaceous feathers on the legs at the base of Maniraptora, and then up within Avialae, when we got to Ornithures, we lose those long leg feathers. Okay, and so here is a illustration by Emily Willoughby of Deinonychus, so a dromaeosaur, and this is probably far more likely what a true dromaeosaur looks like than the scaly, featherless creatures in the Jurassic Park series. Well, let's talk about flight. There are different forms of aerial locomotion that animals use. Very small-bodied animals can get away with just jumping out and falling to the ground. It has to do with scale effects. So as you get larger and larger, the effects of falling get worse and worse. So there was a famous, I'll get it right, I'll paraphrase it at least, statement in biomechanics that a mouse that falls down a well can survive. A dog falls down a well, it breaks its back. A horse falls down a well, it splashes. As you get larger and larger, the effect of things like falling get worse and worse. Going the other direction, an ant falling out of the tree doesn't matter. It's fine. It's totally fine. And indeed, the air on the way down is far more viscous to it because it's so small. Air is stickier on that scale. And so there are bugs that actually use jumping out of trees as a form of aerial locomotion. Some of them actually modify how they hold their legs to actually control their way down. And then we have gliders. In terms of vertebrates, gliding is by far the most common form of aerial locomotion. So that is creating some sort of broad surface on the body and taking advantage of the air coming up underneath you to generate some lift. Now, a glider typically can't get any higher than the level it started out with. But it's a great way to get down from the trees to the ground or from tree to tree. Not surprisingly, gliders typically, with some exceptions, are arboreal, or tree-dwelling animals. And I'll show you a sampling of gliding vertebrates to begin in the next slide. And then there is true powered flight, or as it says here, flapping flight. Invertebrates, that's birds, bats, and the extinct pterosaurs. And then insects are the fourth, and actually the first example. So gliders. We have so-called flying fish. They don't actually fly, they glide. Their flight membrane is their wings, their fin, the pectoral fin. I've actually been on a boat when some flew into us. It's kind of weird. There are flying frogs. In their case, the flight membrane is the webbed hands and feet that they stretch out. There are flying snakes. They actually just sort of flatten their body out, their entire body surface. They're in Southeast Asia, or is it Indonesia? You don't have to worry about them here. There are a bunch, there's the flying lizard Draco, and a bunch of extinct gliders that use their ribs, or projections from the ribs, to generate the flight membrane. And then in mammals, there's several groups of gliders. There are gliding marsupials, sugar gliders. There is the so-called flying lemurs. They're technically not lemurs, but they're sort of cousins of the primates. There are the flying squirrels. There's actually multiple groups of flying squirrels. One big attribute of gliding mammals is they're all super cute. And part of that has to do with the fact that they typically have to have very big eyes in order to navigate. You can't really do aerial navigation using smell or your whiskers. So really big eyes, we tend to register with us as being cute. But actual true powered flight, that is to be volant, to use the Latin term, has only evolved, as far as we know, 4 times, or rather within 4 groups of animals. The earliest case is insects, and then these 3 down here. So let's take them one by one. Insects were the first into the air. They got into the air back in the Carboniferous period. So when the vertebrates were just figuring out that maybe you could lay your eggs on land and not go into the pond. And they've been doing super well ever since. They are, of course, by far the most common group of animals. The second group to get into the air were the pterosaurs. And they did so in the late Triassic. Remember, pterosaurs are a type of ornithurine archosaur. We will talk about pterosaur biology in more detail before we get to the end of the course. We're going to review some of the major Mesozoic groups of animals before we talk about their extinction. So the oldest pterosaurs are contemporaries with some of the oldest dinosaurs. And indeed, pterosaur flight had been perfected. Well, as far as anything is perfected in nature. They were excellent flyers when Humaniraptorans, the clade that includes birds, were just beginning to learn how to fly. So here we see a little dinosaur looking up hopefully. Maybe someday. Bats. Bats are a type of placental mammal. The oldest fossils, like this Onchonictorus, are from the Eocene, about 55 billion years ago. But at that point, they're already completely bat. They lack some of the traits of modern groups of bats, but they're still fully bat. And we don't have the equivalent to Archaeopteryx and Anchiornis and Confuciusornis and so forth in bat history. So they remain a bit of a mystery in terms of their origins. In fact, if we find like gliding precursors to bats in the latest Cretaceous, 0 paleontologists will be surprised. That's almost the expectation. We just haven't found them yet. And the bat wing, as I talked about when I talked about homology before, it's the hand. And it's skin stretched between the hand and also from the hand to the ankle. And so yes, they fly through the power of jazz hands. So pterosaurs similarly had skin stretched between the hand. In this case, it's mostly the ring finger. As I'll talk about later on, the ring finger is the wing finger in pterosaurs. It goes to the leg, and there's also a flight membrane that goes between the legs, at least ancestrally. Birds also use the forelimb in flight, but just the forelimb in flight. The hind limb is separated from the wing. So in bats, it's part of the wing. In pterosaurs, it's part of the wing. In birds, it isn't. And of course, in birds, it's not skin, it's feathers. So birds are different. And here we can actually see, now granted this is a flightless bird, but you can see the way it's holding its hand because it's just naked skin underneath, the orientation of the hand relative to the big feathers. So how did dinosaurian flight evolve? Well, it didn't happen like this. Nor did it happen to sauropods. In the 19th and 20th century, there was this real big debate in terms of flight origins. People were in different camps in these. And there was sort of the trees down model, which is also going to call it the arboreal model, or the ground up, or cursorial model. And here are 2 diagrams representing both of those. So let's take them step by step. The arboreal model, or trees down model, was the idea that perhaps the ancestors of birds were scansorial, that is climbing, or arboreal animals, that they had a parachuting phase, so they're jumping down out of the trees, and then evolved adaptations that allowed them to glide, so better control from jumping down from trees, until eventually they were creatures that jumped out of trees and didn't land as they kept going under their own power. Now, the argument for this, the arguments for this was, one, gliders are common. As we saw, lots of gliders among vertebrate groups. And indeed, the anatomy of pterosaurs and bats suggests that gliding, perhaps something like a flying frog in terms of its anatomy, could have been part of their ancestral anatomy in terms of gliders. Also, this is biomechanically easier. If you think about this, we can do this without too much effort. That is, a hang glider is not a particularly complex piece of equipment. And we can do this sort of thing, not from a tree, because that would typically get tangled up, but since we're much larger organisms, the equivalent of a tree, a cliff, or a big hill, or a big sand dune, and we can jump off and take advantage of the lift as we're coming down and head off into the air. So, you can see some of the arguments for this. However, other people saw flaws with the arboreal model, and they considered a cursorial, which is running, or ground-up model. And this was the idea that, first of all, birds and bird outgroups have perfectly good hind limbs that aren't part of the wing. We would expect that hind limb to be part of the wing if they were gliders. But they aren't. They're perfectly good runners for the most part. In fact, those birds that can't run are typically highly, highly specialized derived birds, like, say, penguins or hummingbirds or so forth, tropic birds. And so perhaps the adaptations related to flight evolved in a running context, maybe to help them, as you show here, maybe to catch insects or other prey, or maybe to help them as fast turners. Some people suggest maybe they're flapping to accelerate when they're running on the ground. They're going faster and faster. And then eventually, They're going farther jumps and farther, and eventually they're jumping and not coming back down. That is, they're actually using powered flight. So, the idea of running, leaping, and or turning enhancements that increase lift. And the primary argument for this was that the immediate outgroups to living birds and primitive modern birds have great running legs, and that's very different from bats and pterosaurs. In fact, there's only one group of bat which is very good at moving on the ground. It's appropriate for this time of year. It's the vampires. Vampires are the one group of bat that are they can actually run, they can gallop. And that's because their lifestyle involves them coming on the ground, going over to hoofed mammals and other mammals and biting on their feet to suck their blood. So here we see a bunch of different birds running to various degrees. So we've got ostriches, which are the fastest bipedal animals in the world today. We have kiwis, which are not. And then here, these are two groups of flying birds. You see here an owl and a coot. So that's actually a loop. It doesn't keep on running. Normally they run for a while on the water, start flapping, and take off from that. But perfectly good running legs. Well, the kiwi not so much running, but they have a different lifestyle. Now, about 20 years ago, at the conference, Society of Vertebrate Paleontology, we saw some video footage showing this bird flapping its wings back and forth while it's running. And the presenter, Dr. Ken Dial, said, "Look at this. Does this support the idea, the cursorial model, of an animal using its wings to help accelerate it to run faster? This is a chukar pigeon, a chukar partridge, a sort of modern bird." He said, but I was lying to you in one aspect. And that was the orientation of the video camera. In fact, it was flapping while running uphill. And it turned out what they had documented at their team, although they were trying to do something entirely different, was a behavior that turns out is widespread among living birds, but no one had really paid attention to it. In fact, no one had paid attention to it, so they didn't even give it a name, really. And so they had to come up with a name. It's wing-assisted incline running, or WARE. So here we see from below and from above this chukar running up a log. It is not climbing. Climbing is the wrong metaphor. It's the wrong term. It's not grasping and pulling with its feet. It is running, but it is running vertically. And it's able to do that because it's flapping its wings. What happens is the act of flapping its wings is generating an acceleration through its feet. And that's providing more contact as the feet touch the substrate, touch the log. It's the equivalent of a spoiler on like a Formula One race car. You know, those race cars with those gigantic rear wheels have such powerful engines that if they didn't have that spoiler, that wing, the action of those wheels would actually throw them up above the ground. But because they've got that wing on it, the faster they go, the more there's an acceleration downward. And that keeps those wheels in contact with the ground and they can go faster. So by flapping, they're generating enough acceleration in their feet that they can use the ordinary motion of legs to run up a trunk or a log or what have you. Now, it changes ontogenetically. So a little baby can't really do it. So the baby is climbing there. That is a climb, not a run, not a wear. The 5-day-old one is beginning to do wear, but barely. But give it a couple days, and it's much better. And indeed, in the experiment that they did, they first of all looked at I'll show you how this works. So this is the age of the bird. The dots use a set of experimental runs, and the data there is the maximum slope that they could run up after several trials. And you see the angle, the slope they could run up gets higher and higher as they get older and older. And what's happening is their wings are getting better and better. Note, the almost fully grown ones are running on the underside. It's greater than 90 degrees, so able to run on the underside. But they're running, they're not climbing. And then, additionally, if they hold the wings in place, if they pin the wings down and they use only their legs, they can't do much better than a 45-degree angle. Additionally, they tried it with a smooth surface and a coarse surface. And within each of those, they tried it where they had plucked the feathers. Feathers regrow, so it's like here, don't worry. They trimmed the feathers, so they cut the feathers so the wing is only 50% the area it would be otherwise. And then C is the control group. And you could see that as wing surface area increases, the angle they could run up increases. That is the perfect type of setting for natural selection to work on, where a slight change has a marked selective advantage, because the steeper the angle you can run up means the more places you can get away from predators. And that's the sort of thing that natural selection can easily modify and use to increase your wing size. And so this is sort of a summary of those data as we look at it. But as their research continued, they also looked at the other half of the situation, not just coming into the trees, but coming down out of the trees. It had actually been known that many types of birds use this, which is called controlled flapping descent, or CFD. And it's where young birds, which are too young to fly, nevertheless use their wings on the way down to control the rate and direction of descent. It's not just gliding. In fact, it is not gliding. It's not, strictly speaking, parachuting either. It's a powered form of aerial locomotion. That gives them an important advantage. That is, once you're up in a tree, how do you get back down? And as the research continued, this team found more and more groups of birds in the modern world actually do this. And there's a link on the lecture notes of looking at the phylogeny of this in modern birds. So this is controlled flapping descent. So where to get up into trees, controlled flapping descent to get out of that, all of them in individuals which cannot use powered flight yet. So that's the key there. They're not powered flyers yet. Eventually, when they grow up, they'll be powered flyers. But one of the key elements that Dial and his subsequent students and their students have looked at is the fact that many of the adaptations required to do this are not in Aves. That is, they didn't originate in Aves, or they didn't even originate in Avialian. They are Panaraptorine traits, like the ability to fold up the hand and then flap it out, the sideways oriented shoulder joint, the great big pennaceous feathers, and good running legs. And there, of course, would be a selective advantage to be able to get up into trees in the Mesozoic, because your big cousins can't eat you then. And indeed, in primitive birds, that's the main reason to get up in trees. They do not nest in trees. That is, they don't build nests for their eggs. They get up in trees in order to get away from predators. Now, additionally, more work looking at the morphology of early branches of avialians suggests that they were no better at powered flight than small dromaeosaurids or troodontids. They couldn't flap their wings as good a degree as euornithine and enantiornithine birds, so ornithotheracine birds. So Archaeopteryx, despite our image of it as being a good flyer, because people said it's the first bird, birds are flyers, therefore it's a good flyer, probably wasn't. Let's not say it wasn't a flyer, just not a good flyer. And so, if we look at the evolution of the associated traits, pennaceous feathers seem to occur in creatures that initially could not do wing-assisted incline running or CFD. Like ornithomimosaurs, they don't have the right anatomy for that at any point of their life cycle. So pennaceous feathers may be for display or for brooding. But Panaraptorines, at least as babies, probably could do wing-assisted incline running and CFD. Perfectly helpful thing if you're a small animal and there's lots of big predators around. Now, the Scansoriopterigids, one of the dragons that would be threatened by a tennis racket, did evolve a bat, a protobat or pterosaur-like gliding membrane on the wing. They were probably gliders, but they are not on the main line to Avialae. It's a second attempt, or as an attempt for creatures to use aerial locomotion after they're up in the trees. And then limited power flight seems to evolve at least once, but probably multiple times, in Humaniraptora. So let's take a look at some of these in a little more detail. Oh, just to remind you again. So here's a turkey up in the trees. The dad is not nesting up there, but he's protecting his babies. So Scansoriopterigids, a failed experiment in gliding. They weren't particularly good gliders either. The amount of flight membrane on them isn't huge, but nature tries. But, and this remains a big question, if we look at something like Microraptor and some of the small Troodontids and Anchiornis, they seem to have very similar flight adaptations. So is it homologous between Deinonychosaurs and Avialian? Could the common ancestor of all Avialians have limited power flight? That's one hypothesis. And then later examples like Deinonychus and Velociraptor and Utahraptor, at least as adults, would have been flightless. But they'd be the equivalent of ostriches or what have you. However, it's also worth noting that many of the basal dromaeosaurids and basal Troodontids also have short arms. So it might be that where and CFD was simply common at the base of Humaniraptora, and once you've got that ability and you've got pennaceous feathers on your arm, natural selection can tinker in different lineages to independently create flyers. So that Microraptor might be an independent sort of flyer than, say, Avialians. So actually this was looking at a number of different parameters, and taxa that get beyond this line for the oranges and beyond this line for the blue likely had some form of actual powered flight, and so we get things like Microraptor or Rahonavis, and so forth, and then independently Avialians, whereas the other forms may not have been good powered flyers. Maybe, though, however, limited power flyers. So in this version, full powered flight we see in green, and we see it evolving multiple times independently in Humaniraptora. Now, how about those long leg feathers? Just want to run through this quickly before I wrap this up. When the long leg feathers were first found in Microraptor, and then subsequently seen in basal Avialians, people said, oh, now we finally have evidence that the leg was also a wing in Avialian, as it is in pterosaurs and bats. However, and this is just to remind you of the distribution. I'm not sure that this should be down here. Sorry, that lower Deinonychosauria, that's Humaniraptor. However, you can't actually put the leg of a Humaniraptor so a Deinonychosaur or a bird in this position. Or rather, you could do it once, after which it's out of its socket. So they couldn't move the leg all the way out to make it a flight surface, as some people were thinking. It violates what we know about the femur acetabulum articulation. In other words, it pops it out of its socket. However, long leg feathers can have a flight function even if they're not generating lift. For instance, they might have helped them to control their landing. Think of the vertical plane, the vertical tail wing on a plane. It helps control direction. It doesn't generate lift, but it helps control direction. And indeed, long leg feathers are present in some predatory birds today that have a diving strike. Also, it does seem that it really does help them steer while they were going through the air, some wind tunnel studies. And then we see, when we get the true tail feather showing up, rather than the true tail fan in Ornithurae, that's the same time we lose the long leg feathers. Okay, so with that, we wrap up our look at dinosaurian diversity from a phylogenetic standpoint. On Monday, we'll look at dinosaur history in a different fashion, and that's the last new information to go for the exam. And that's going to be looking at them as communities through time. So we've explored each of the different branches in time, but now we're going to look at the assemblage from the late Jurassic to the late Triassic up to the end of the Cretaceous. So have a good weekend. Happy Halloween. Also, happy Thanksgiving a little early.